Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today we've got a very special episode that Sabrina prepared.
Yeah, all about dinosaur size with a heavy emphasis on how big they could get.
And why they got so big.
So you might guess this is a sauropod heavy episode. But don't worry, I also talk about theropods and hadrosaurs.
Nice.
And we'll get a little bit into the small dinosaurs too.
We did have an ankylosaur heavy episode last week, so I can't really complain about this one being sauropod heavy.
There we go.
And it is, when you're talking about how dinosaurs got so big, or even just how land animals could get so big, sauropods are the best example.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else compares ever in all of Earth's history.
Darn right.
So definitely the right focus for a big dinosaur episode.
We also have dinosaur of the day, Giraffatitan.
Sounds like a titanosaur.
Sure is.
Fits with the theme. And you're also doing the fun fact. But before we get into all of that, as always, we like to thank some patrons for helping us to keep our podcast running and giving us the freedom to do random episodes like How Dinosaurs Got So Big without worrying about algorithms too much. And this week, we'd like to thank Stefan, Elrex, Timo from Pro Art Cut, Bill Jago, Professor Herrerasaurus, Juliana, Ayumi, Ian, Ermal, and Cassidy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a dino-it-all. We hope you enjoy this episode.
And if you are a patron, last week's episode about ankylosaurs, we had an extra segment in the regular episode planned, which was about how different ankylosaurs are related to each other and potential new groups of ankylosaurs, which are coming out of the woodwork as we learn more about ankylosaurs. But it made the episode a little bit too long, so we released it as special bonus content for our patrons. So if you're a patron, make sure to check out that bonus segment. And if you want to learn more about ankylosaurs and how they're all related in their evolutionary tree, then maybe you want to be a patron and listen to it.
Jumping into the episode, there's quite a bit of news sources and a lot of recent ones. It's kind of what inspired me to put together this episode. So if you want to see a list of sources that went into the making of this one, then check out the show notes on iknowdino.com. So one of the biggest questions when it comes to dinosaurs is, how did they get so big?
How did they get so big?
Well, I will tell you, it was a lot of fun to dig into. But first, I want to answer the question, just how big did they get? The longest, heaviest, and overall largest dinosaurs were, of course, the sauropods. Biggest and best, some might say.
Some might. Biggest, most would say. Everybody who knows the correct answer. Best, I don't know. That's up for debate.
Anyway, the biggest sauropod of all time may have been Bruhathkayosaurus, which was originally thought to be amphicoelius. And there are estimates that this sauropod, and again, sauropods are the really large dinosaurs that walked on fours with the columnar legs, and they had the long necks and the long tails, and relatively small heads. So for Bruhathkayosaurus, the estimates range from 190 feet or 58 meters long and weighing 150 tons, metric tons, or 170 short tons. I felt like we needed to say both of these when we get to these gigantic numbers.
Yeah, they start to diverge a little bit.
Yeah. So that's on the high end there. There's other estimates that it was 102 feet or 31 meters long, or other estimates that it was 115 to 131 feet or 35 to 40 meters long and weighing 70 to 120 tons.
Yeah, and I think the smaller ones are more recent estimates, which is basically acknowledging that even though this vertebra might have been huge, there were some sauropods that had huge vertebra, but they didn't just scale with the length of the animal. They just had unusually tall vertebrae. So that might have been the case with this dinosaur. And again, it's based on that one and only vertebra, which is totally missing now, so we can't even really be sure that that vertebra was drawn accurately to begin with.
But I like that there's a dinosaur out there that was estimated to get up to 190 feet long.
At one point, yeah.
At one point.
I think that is now considered a little bit unlikely.
Sure. But that is why I'm saying that one may have been the biggest sauropod of all time.
Yes, probably the biggest estimate we've had.
But it may not have been the heaviest. Because when it comes to dinosaur size, I think there's a few ways you can go. You can go by height, length, and weight.
Yep. Yeah, that's when someone says biggest. What do you mean by biggest? Tallest? Heaviest? We usually go by heaviest, I think is.
Oh, I think sometimes we go by length.
Occasionally, yeah, that's true. But if you have like a long, skinny tail, is that really. It's like having that long spire on the top of a large building. Does that really make it that much taller? I don't know. Depends.
Yeah. So for heaviest, that award could go to Bruhathkayosaurus, which has been estimated to be 115 feet or 35 meters long and weighing over 80 tons. Although a 2023 estimate just last year is thinking it could be between 120 and 190 tons, but I will get to that in more detail later.
Once you cross over the 100-ton threshold, that's just ridiculous. That is ridiculous size. Nothing but whales should be that big.
Oh, there are whale comparisons to be made, yes.
I'm sure.
As for the tallest sauropod known, that could be Sauroposeidon, which is estimated to be up to 54 to 59 feet or 16 and a half to 18 meters tall with its head held high because it's thought to be a high browser.
That's like a 5 to 6 story building. That is a tall animal.
Yes. But like I mentioned before, I've got some other dinosaurs to talk about. It wasn't just the sauropods that got big, even though they were the biggest. There were a lot of large theropods. And the largest theropod known, I believe, is Spinosaurus.
If we're going by length.
Yes. It's estimated to be up to 59 feet or 18 meters long and weigh up to almost 21 metric tons or 23 short tons. There are later estimates, though, that say it was probably more like 49 to 52 feet or 15 to 16 meters long and weighing up to 7.5 metric tons, 8.3 short tons.
Yeah, I think that's more accurate because that came after we found the tail.
Mm-hmm. There are some other theropod contenders for being very large, though. There's Giganotosaurus or Gigantosaurus. The largest specimens known are estimated to be up to 43 feet or a little over 13 meters long. And of course, Tyrannosaurus, where the largest specimens known are estimated to be up to 40 feet or over 12 meters long.
Yeah, and Tyrannosaurus is probably the heaviest of those.
Then there's the ornithopods. Don't want to forget them. The largest one known is Shantungosaurus. And it was a large saurolophine hadrosaur, so a duckbill without a crest, that lived in the late Cretaceous in what is now China. And it's been estimated to be up to 49 to 54 feet or 15 to over 16 meters long and weighing up to 16 metric tons or 18 short tons.
Yeah, that's really big.
Yes.
Maybe one of the more famous ones that's also really big is something like Edmontosaurus. Was very impressively huge too.
Yes. Not quite as large, but yes.
Yeah.
Now I keep saying these are the dinosaurs known, or these are probably the biggest dinosaurs, because even though we know about some of these extra large dinosaurs, it's unlikely we'll know how big the biggest of the biggest got.
Mm-hmm.
We'll never know if we found the biggest individual of any species, or even if we've discovered all of the species.
Yeah. It reminds me of the paper about T-Rex size, where they were basically just taking a statistical approach for it and saying, if you look at typical sort of distributions of animal sizes and that 1 in 1,000 huge one, we haven't found the 1 in 1,000 huge one of T-Rex. So the biggest one ever we'll probably never know, but we might not even have the biggest one of the year or of the month in an ecosystem.
Yes.
Just because so few fossilize. But we do have a good average. And usually average is what you want to go with anyway when you're talking about animal sizes.
Not when you're talking about the biggest.
I guess, yeah.
Just for some comparisons to mammals, the biggest mammal is the blue whale. That's about 98 feet or 30 meters long, and it weighs about 160 tons or 145 metric tons.
Yeah, and I think there have been some reports of blue whales that approached around 200 tons.
So very heavy. One of the largest known land mammals is Paraceratherium, which is was a giant hornless rhino. It lived about 34 to 23 million years ago in what is now Eurasia. And it's estimated to have been about 16.5 tons 15 metric tons, and be about 16 feet or 5 meters high at the shoulder.
Yeah, that was a really interesting looking animal. I remember years ago you were playing a park builder game and you had that thing in your zoo. And I was like, what is that thing? They just made that up for this game. But no, it's a real animal.
Oh, it was a mammal.
Yeah.
Just weren't used to seeing mammals.
Yeah, not that size. And sort of like weird wedge shape too. Almost like Brachiosaurus with like the longer front legs.
Yeah. So back to the dinosaurs. How were dinosaurs able to physically get so large? It's probably due to a few factors. Dinosaurs laid eggs. That meant that their eggs or hatchlings could start out small and then grow. And as mammals, we grow up the babies in our bodies, and that puts some size limitations on the babies. Saurischians, which include theropods and sauropods, had bird-like respiratory systems, and that means that they had lighter bones. Their air sacs helped to keep them lighter. And they also efficiently inhaled oxygen. Bird-like lungs means that they're continuously taking in oxygen, so this helps them to get big.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite little factoids about how they got so big, especially when you're talking about sauropod long necks.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you imagine you have to breathe in through, say, a Mamenchosaurus neck that's 50 feet long,
Mm-hmm.
it takes a long time for that air to get all the way down into your lungs. And then if you breathe out, it takes a long time to exhale, and then you're going to not have any air until you manage to breathe it all the way back in down that 50-foot neck. If you're doing what we call tidal breathing, which is what mammals do, where the diaphragm goes up and pushes the air out and then down and pulls the air in. But what birds did and what dinosaurs did is they had air sacs that filled in, sort of, the description is usually like bellows.
Mm-hmm.
So they expanded their chest cavity. They would fill the air sacs and the lungs. And then when they collapsed or pressed in on their chest cavity, it would press the air out of the air sacs into the lungs and the air out of the lungs out of the mouth. But since that air had just refilled from the air sacs into the lungs are actually sort of fixed and don't move. They don't collapse. So there's always new oxygen in there. It's the air sacs, sort of like storage, secondary storage containment for the air that fills and empties, whereas the air is always maintained in the lungs. So they have these extra storage lungs that we call air sacs. And that means that they don't have to worry as much about how quickly they can get the air in and out of their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty awesome.
All helps in getting large.
It does.
In terms of why they got large, it could be because then it was easier to eat more food or easier to get at food, or it could have been for defense.
It's also impressive for mates.
Yeah, that's true. Was it really an advantage to get so big, though? Because big animals tend to go extinct during major extinction events, and that happened with the non-avian dinosaurs. But it was probably an advantage for a while.
Yeah, like well over 100 million years.
Yeah. So I got to start with the sauropods, the biggest of the biggest dinosaurs. P. Martin Sander had an article titled Sauropods in Current Biology, which talks about how the largest sauropods were at least 4 times heavier than the largest land mammals, and they were the largest of dinosaur species. Again, sauropods, they're known for their long necks. Sometimes those necks were up to 14 to 15 meters or 46 to 49 feet long, like with Mamenchosaurus,
Yeah.
which have up to 19 neck bones or vertebrae.
I like that because we were just talking about how the longest theropod might have been around 49 feet long with Spinosaurus, updated measurements, and that's just the neck.
Yeah.
It doesn't include the body, from the front legs to the back legs or the tail. Just the neck alone is like the length of a Spinosaurus.
Yeah, and with sauropods, their necks were mostly horizontal or at a low angle, and then, of course, they had those air sacs to help keep the neck light, and they had relatively small heads. The long neck with the small head, I like this analogy, was like a construction crane, and it made it easy to gather food, but with not too much energy.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I've also heard it described sort of like a sprinkler, how a sprinkler can cover a lot of area by sweeping back and forth without physically moving the sprinkler in the middle. Same sort of thing with a dinosaur head. You can swing from side to side, gobbling up food without having to move that huge, heavy body too much.
Yeah. And then, of course, sauropods, again, they walked on those 4 columnar legs. They had long tails that helped them counterbalance, and it also anchored muscles that pulled the back legs when walking. And sometimes the tail adds to their length, like with Diplodocus. Sauropods are known for being long, but in many cases, they're also known for being really heavy, even though they had those pneumatic bones to help keep the skeleton lighter. And again, that bird-like respiratory system. They grew fast, which was good, meant they were less likely to be preyed upon. They tended to reach skeletal maturity around 30 to 40 years old. That's when they got to full size. It's hard to know exactly their lifespan, but they did live a long time as fully grown animals based on how we see bone remodeling. Sander wrote, quote, "Whereas in popular culture, sauropods are often depicted as the ultimate failure in evolution."
What?
Yeah, exactly the opposite is the case. No other herbivore in the history of land animals was equally successful by a wide margin and by any measure, end quote.
I can't remember ever thinking of sauropods as a failure in evolution.
Maybe when they're the big lumbering giants depiction.
I suppose so, yeah, because there were those early hypotheses that the reason dinosaurs went extinct was because they were too dumb or they were too slow or whatever, and so they were doomed for extinction. But yeah, we've never thought of them that way.
Sure haven't.
But we're post-dinosaur renaissance people.
That's true. But yeah, sauropods did really well because they existed for at least 135 million years, starting the beginning of the Jurassic 201 million years ago to the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago. And they were also the dominant herbivores on all continents for a lot of that time. Only, quote, being rivaled during the late Cretaceous on some land masses by hadrosaurs, end quote. Hadrosaurs really don't get enough credit.
Yeah. Ceratopsians were doing pretty well too at the end of the Cretaceous.
But sauropods, also, there's hundreds of known species, so there was a lot of diversity there. And a large sauropod begins at about 22 tons. A giant one is around 55 tons. And then super giant ones, because that's how extreme you have to get with these animals, they're over 88 tons, or, quote, the mass of a baleen whale.
Did you come up with those categories, or did someone else come up with the large, giant, and super giant?
Sander talked about that in his sauropods paper.
Okay.
But I like that those are the categories.
Large, giant, and super giant.
And most sauropods were large to super giant in size, though there were some dwarf ones on islands like Europasaurus. In the paper, he said, quote, "The 20-ton barrier, larger than any other land animal, was already broken by some of the earliest sauropods."
Yeah, and it got broken multiple times throughout evolution. It wasn't like they just evolved to be big and stayed big. There were different lineages that got big and then small again, and then other ones would show up and get huge.
Yeah.
There are lots of different sauropods that got huge throughout that time period from 200 to 66 million years ago.
As a quick side note, the sauropod babies were already built to grow large. That was the finding in a paper in paleontological research by Ratanaforn a team, and others. This team, they found a partial juvenile vertebral column of a sauropod that lived in the early Jurassic. It was found in Thailand. And they found that it already looked a lot like an adult sauropod's form, with these hollow depressions that help keep the bones light. So it looks actually similar to Tezodosaurus, which was our Dinosaur of the Day in episode 439. And that one grew up to be 33 feet or 10 meters long and weigh up to 8 metric tons. So they were always, well, from baby to adult, they were meant to be big. And we'll get into sauropods and sauropodomorphs in a bit. But first, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. So I can't really talk about sauropods without also talking about sauropodomorphs.
Technically, sauropods are sauropodomorphs.
Yes. Sauropodomorphs is a group that includes sauropods. And sauropodomorphs showed up in the late Triassic about 237 million years ago. You can think about animals such as Plateosaurus is a sauropodomorph, and that one lived in the late Triassic, and it walked on 2 legs.
Yeah, usually when people say sauropodomorphs, they're talking about early sauropodomorphs and not later sauropods. Just like if you say archosauromorphs or archosaurs, you wouldn't usually use that word if you're talking about birds. You just say birds. The only reason to use the broader category is generally if you're talking about all of them, or you're just talking about the early ones that don't fit into the later groups.
Yes, because those early sauropodomorphs disappeared near the end of the early Jurassic. And then the later ones, the sauropods, kind of had free reign and they were doing all kinds of stuff real quick after that.
Yeah, so sauropodomorphs were mostly Triassic and very early Jurassic.
Mm-hmm.
Or the basal sauropodomorphs before regular sauropods took over.
The earliest sauropodomorphs were small omnivores. They weighed less than 10 kilograms.
Small.
Yes. There's a study done by Kimberly Chappell and others, published in the Royal Society of Open Science, talking about this. Real quick, though, so the sauropodomorphs, they appeared in the late Triassic. By the early Jurassic, though, some sauropodomorphs weighed more than 10 tons. So they go from 10 kilograms to 10 tons.
Yeah. Yeah, like Ladumahati.
Yes. Or, so on the small side, Saturnalia weighed 11 kilograms or 24 pounds. And then on the bigger side, Massospondylus weighed about 550 kilograms or about 1,200 pounds. For comparison, it's not like this is a weird thing with dinosaurs because modern mammals come in a wide range of sizes too, anywhere from like 10 grams to 7 tons.
Yeah.
So this team did histology on a humerus, an arm bone, that was found in the Elliott Formation in South Africa from the early Jurassic. It was from a skeletally mature sauropodomorph that was estimated to weigh a little over 75 kilograms, which is, quote, one of the smallest known sauropodomorph taxa. That fossil had been found in 1978, and provisionally it was referred to Massospondylus, but this study found that it had unique features, so it could be its own genus, but they didn't name it. It was a nearly complete left humerus, and they found 15 lags, lines of arrested growth, like the tree rings that you see.
Once a year.
Once a year, yeah.
Yeah, so we presume then it was at least 15 years old.
And they had 11 closely spaced lags.
Meaning that its growth had slowed down.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, it was similar in size to a Massospondylus humerus that only had 4 lags.
Ooh, that one grew a lot faster.
Yeah. So this is the smallest confirmed adult from the early Jurassic Massopoda onwards. It's about 49%, quote, the size of the largest known co-occurring Massospondylus carinatus individual. And it helps show that there's a bunch of diversity of sauropodomorphs in the early Jurassic and the Elliott Formation. Sauropodomorphs, in general, grew rapidly. A study by Jennifer Botha and others in Current Biology found that relatively small ancestors of giant sauropods evolved rapid growth. And it's an early evolving trait for the giant sauropods. So they studied the histology of Erdonyx and Cephaloposaurus, and both have evidence for growing quickly but being interrupted seasonally, and with limited developmental plasticity, the ability to react to its environment. The bones they studied came from early to late subadults. There's no evidence that they stopped growing, but the growth seems to have slowed. They found these annual interruptions in growth in mid-growth stage, so it seems like it was a seasonally interrupted growth kind of thing.
And that's how you get the lags?
Yes.
Just like in a tree?
Yes. And so both of these dinosaurs were small. They were at most weighed 1 to 2 tons, and they had the rapid but interrupted growth. Most non-sauropodin sauropodomorphs tend to have slower growth rates. They have relatively slow rates of bone tissue formation. But then sauropods tended to grow faster. There's a clade of early sauropodiforms called lessemsaurids that are sometimes thought to be the most basal sauropod taxa, or a sister taxon to Sauropoda. They include dinosaurs like Lessemsaurus, Inhentia, Ladumahati. And they walked on all fours, they had the columnar legs, and they flexed their forelimbs. They could get very large, like over 10 tons. Ladumahati was about 12 tons. And they grew rapidly and cyclically, and they got very large. Ardonyx and Cephaloposaurus seem similar to lessemsaurids, and they also grew rapidly, quote, differing from the slower cyclical growth of their non-sauropodiform ancestors and therefore suggesting an earlier phylogenetic origin for this distinctive pre-sauropodin growth strategy from within Sauropodomorpha, end quote. So it goes back to these ancestors of the sauropods that grew so big. Turns out they were growing fast. So Ardonyx and Cephaloposaurus were similar to lessemsaurids in that they also grew rapidly, versus other basal sauropodomorphs that grew more slowly.
But they were all cyclical at that point.
Yes. But it seems like this ability to grow quickly helped start the whole ability to grow so large.
Gotcha. So it's not like the dragons in some mythology where they were so big because they just lived a really long time and grew slowly the whole time.
Yeah.
In sauropodomorphs, they were growing really fast up to a small to medium size. And then over time, they kept growing fast, but increased the maximum size.
Yes, although they found that the rapid growth was independent of body size evolution, which is similar to a finding of a recent theropod study. So yeah, these two dinosaurs, they could grow fast, especially during a favorable growing season. The fact that they were on the smaller side might have been because they had shorter seasonal growth periods, or maybe there's some variation in their rates of growth. But being able to grow rapidly could have been really advantageous for them. And the author said it was, quote, most likely a prerequisite for gigantism in later branching sauropods, end quote. What's really interesting is looking at when sauropods got so big. Michael Demick had a paper about this in Current Biology. Again, sauropods were several times heavier than the next heaviest land animals. There's over 250 known sauropod species. Fossils, though, are patchy for many of them. Like in some cases we've talked about, even it's one or two bones and they've disappeared.
Yeah.
Luckily, though, there's still a way to learn from even the patchy fossil record. So he presented models to predict the unknown limb bone measurements in sauropods, and then based on that could map sauropod body mass evolution. So you kind of fill in the blanks and then you map it all out and then you see what the patterns are. And it turns out sauropods were even more successful than we had thought. Like previously, before this study, the thinking was that sauropods evolved gigantism a few times, but now we know it happened 36 times over 100 million years around the world on at least 6 land masses and in at least 5 not closely related clades or groups. So 36 different times sauropods got bigger than other land animals.
That is a lot of massive size.
Yes.
And I guess that goes to the point you were making about how they had in their earliest ancestors this ability to grow really fast. You could see how that building block would be really useful and a nice ability that you can apply to getting massive size over and over again.
Yes. Now, to get to this conclusion, he took measurements of the circumferences of hundreds of weight-bearing bones, so leg and arm bones, and used a technique called ancestral state reconstruction to map the body masses, and then mapped these reconstructed body masses of nearly 200 species onto their evolutionary tree. The body masses range from under 5,000 kilograms, or around 11,000 pounds, to around 40,000 kilograms, or over 88,000 pounds.
So 5 tons to 40 tons.
Yes, there were some exceptions too. He found that the median sauropod body mass was about 12 plus or minus 3 metric tons, or, quote, less than half the mass of the largest known fossil mammals, end quote, which is 3/4 the mass of the largest hadrosaurid, or about the same as the largest ceratopsian, and less than 1/6 the mass of the heaviest known sauropod, or one of the heaviest known sauropods, Argentinosaurus. He found that sauropods got big early on, and within each sauropod family, there's one or two that got extremely big. These largest sauropods were ecologically distinct. They had some different shaped teeth and heads. The bodies had some different proportions. So the largest ones had this quote-unquote large bodied niche. And the largest sauropods may have been metabolically distinct.
Some good niche partitioning happening.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is the study of the bones showed that sauropods had different growth rates, similar to patterns in mammals, although the findings go against Cope's rule that animals got bigger over time, evolutionary sense.
That's a rule in name only, though. More of like an observation of something some animals do sometimes.
Right. We covered Cope's rule in episode 480. Well, when we were covering it, that was about how some animal groups shrink over time, because sometimes animals do gradually increase in size over time. That happens when there's less competition for food and shelter, like how invertebrates got bigger over millions of years, or sometimes they get bigger after an extinction event, like the largest animals go extinct, and the smaller animals have the opportunity to get bigger, like mammals after the non-avian dinosaurs. But then some animals get smaller over time, and that happens when there's a lot of competition for food and shelter. Like over time, the animals will spread out, adapt, and get smaller, like with the Alaskan horses in the Ice Age that shrank. This study found that animals got to different body sizes depending on their niche, and that depended on what niche was available. So there's no one feature or set of features that characterizes sauropods that were giant and the ones that were not quite as big. There seems to be a combination of ecological and life history factors that led to it. And there's a lot of convergent evolution. They're doing similar things, but they just don't have the same last common ancestor. Interestingly, we do know that there's no relationship between the mean global temperature and body mass in sauropods, so climate was probably not a big factor in them getting so large.
That used to be one of the top hypotheses, that everything was so big because there was more oxygen in the air, or it was warmer, or some difference in the climate that allowed them to be so big. But the more we learn about dinosaurs and the more we learn about the Mesozoic ecosystems, the more that falls apart.
Yes. Now, sauropods, they first got really big in the Middle Jurassic when Pangaea was breaking up. But the way that they got bigger was different from each other in terms of body proportions, how they moved in their skulls, what they ate, as well as their growth rates, and how they developed their pneumaticity.
Or their air bones.
Yes.
Air-filled bones.
There's no overall trends in the average body mass through time, but some clades did get smaller over time, like Diplodocodea, Titanosauriforms, Titanosauria, which culminated in, quote, repeated evolutionary dwarfing events. So it's unclear why exactly certain lineages were supergiants and others weren't. But some supergiants include 2 lineages within Turriosaura, 7 within Diplodocodea, and 25 within Macronaria, including 3 within Brachiosauridae and 15 within Titanosauria, based on our current knowledge. And for the biggest of the biggest, their ancestors weighed below 15 metric tons or 16.5 tons, which is lighter than the largest hadrosaurids or mammals. So I guess their ancestors started off big, and then their descendants got really big.
Yep.
I want to revisit a really big sauropod, at least in mass, and that's Bruhathkayosaurus. I'd mentioned before a 2023 study. This one was by Gregory Paul and Asier Laramendi. And in their study, they estimated the mass of Bruhathkayosaurus, which was our dinosaur of the day in episode 416. And as a reminder, it was a titanosaur that lived in the late Cretaceous in what's now India. The holotype was found in 1978. It was described in 1987, but those fossils were really fragmentary and they disintegrated in the field jackets. And then a 2022 study found the skeleton was real based on photos and drawings and that the dinosaur was valid. Anyway, they estimated that Bruhathkayosaurus was about 100 feet or 30 meters long. And they also estimated the mass of Bruhathkayosaurus as well as the mass of other large sauropods. And they did this looking at femurs. They found that, quote, super sauropods appear to have rivaled average-sized blue whales in mass and nearly matching the biggest and rare 200-ton known examples of the blue whale. As a side note, the maximum confirmed length of a blue whale is about 98 feet, or almost 30 meters, and weighing up to 199 tons. And they said, quote, blue whales typically mass 100 to 150 tons, with rare females apparently reaching 200 tons, end quote. Pretty interesting.
It's too big.
So they estimated Bruhathkayosaurus to be between 110 and 170 metric tons, or 121 to 187 tons. But they also said it might have been lighter because it had a less robust femur than other titanosaurs. So it was more like, quote, 110 to 130 tons, which is comparable to what is normally found in fully grown female blue whales, end quote. They also said, quote, nevertheless, higher estimates cannot be ruled out since the true proportions of Bruhathkayosaurus remain unknown, end quote.
Yeah, and the whole estimating weight from the size of the femur and the strength of the femur is really challenging because we don't know how overbuilt the femur was for its weight. For example, like if you're building a bridge, right, and you're deciding how strong to make the supports, you can make them just barely strong enough for a typical load going over the top of them. But then if too much weight goes on top, it collapses. So there's usually a couple multiples of the strength of the actual weight of the animal in the limbs because you don't want, you put too much weight on one leg and the leg broke. So it might be 2, 3, 4 times stronger than it really needs to be just for those rare occasions you don't want the leg to break. But we don't know in sauropods what that ratio was. So depending on what you're assuming for how much extra strength they had built into those legs and what sort of behavior they had, like did they rear up and need to have extra strong legs for when they only had their weight on 2 legs, that can throw off your estimates for what the maximum weight might have been.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's just hard to estimate sizes of animals that we mostly know the bones of.
Yeah, we have no idea how much muscle and fat and stuff was on a sauropod. We've never found a mummified sauropod that we can base our models on.
So yeah, titanosaurs, though, they had broader pelvises and abdomens, and that made them probably heavier, even heavier than other massive sauropods. And it could be that there's even heavier dinosaurs out there. They brought up a sauropod footprint from the early Cretaceous of Australia that might belong to a 200-ton sauropod, quote, but the validity of the poorly preserved trace fossil is suspect, end quote.
That's a really good point, because you could imagine doing a model on how much a sauropod would sink while making a footprint if you could figure out the consistency of like a mud from the fossilized footprint surrounding. If you could model how deep it would sink based on its weight and sort of use that mud impression as a analogy for a scale. I haven't seen anybody try to do that, but that would be a fun study.
Yeah. They also wrote, quote, that the biggest creatures of both land and sea may, if the biggest fragmentary dinosaur fossils record animals as massive as estimated herein, have been of similar tonnage, suggests that somewhere in the area of 110 to 200 tons is as big as animals can biologically be, compared to the largest trees that grow to about 600 tons, end quote.
Yep. That's really big.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem like just the amount of strain on the cardiovascular system, like the size of a whale heart is so huge, and the blood pressure and things like giraffes can be really extreme. That, might be pushing the limits of biological systems when you're getting up to 100 tons.
I was thinking also your bones. We talked about the bone remodeling and how there's just kind of wear and tear every year from even just holding up your own weight.
That's true. Yeah, it's just the strain on the body.
Yeah. Oh, those sauropods. Those massively successful sauropods.
Yep.
I'll get into theropods in a minute, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. Again, it wasn't just sauropods that grew so large. Let us not forget the theropods. Michael Demick and others had a really interesting study in Science about theropod growth. Well, theropods, they're known for their hollow bones and having 3 toes in each foot. Most of them were carnivores. They ate meat. And they lived from the late Triassic until today because birds. Birds are theropods. Yep.
They sure are. I was thinking that when you were talking about mammals and how we go from whatever small size to a big size. Birds do too. They go from a gram or 2 up to about 100 kilograms with an ostrich and a hummingbird.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just the modern birds.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, modern dinosaurs. Yeah. So, yeah, like you were saying, theropods, they ranged in size from small, similar to a chameleon, like Anchiornis, for example, to large, like the length of a bus, like Tyrannosaurus. And it turns out there's no relationship between their growth rate and body size. Like the size of them is not impacted by whether they grew faster or slower.
That's so weird.
Yeah. Yeah, some large dinosaurs grew slowly and some smaller dinosaurs grew quickly.
I guess it's kind of that way with birds too, because birds tend to grow up to their maximum size. A lot of them do in a matter of months. And that includes the really small little songbirds and some much bigger birds like a, chicken.
Yeah, that's a good point. For this study, they looked at the femora and tibiae, the thigh and shin bones, to figure out the ages and body masses of dinosaurs. They also looked at dorsal ribs and fibulae to ensure that an individual was going through a rapid growth phase. There was less bone remodeling, so it was easier to see the record. And they did histology. They cut through the bones when possible, and then they did a bunch of CT scans. So they looked at those lags, those growth rings, like a tree's. They measured about 500 lags or growth marks from more than 80 bones of 42 non-avian theropod dinosaurs. And the sizes of these dinosaurs ranged from less than half a meter, or 1.6 feet, to more than 12 meters, or 39 feet long. And they included dinosaurs like Herrerasaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Majungasaurus. And they estimated the maximum annual growth rate for 36 of the taxa. And they found that there were a lot of different growth strategies, surprisingly. For example, Ceratosaurus grew quickly, but Majungasaurus grew slowly, like slower than modern alligators, but they were similar in size.
Meaning Ceratosaurus and Majungasaurus were similar in size?
Yes. And Spinosaurus and some Carcharodontosaurids grew over a long period of time.
Oh yeah, Carcharodontosaurids were some of the slowest growing ones.
But Tyrannosaurus grew quickly. And it looks like the ancestral theropod grew pretty quickly. That could be because of having a faster metabolism and becoming warm-blooded. They did find a consistent decrease, though, in the maximum annual growth rate on the line that led to birds, which makes sense. Birds are smaller than their non-avian counterparts.
Yeah, but then birds today grow very fast.
Yes, they grew quickly even at their smaller body sizes. So lots of interesting findings here.
Oh, I see what you mean. Maximum annual growth rate, not in terms of percentage of their total size, in terms of like pounds per year.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the line that led to birds, they got smaller over a long period of time, even though they grew quickly.
Gotcha.
Well, we've covered the theropods. What about the hadrosaurs, one might ask?
You're covering all the bases.
Not so much ceratopsians.
Oh, true.
But there was an interesting study in Cretaceous research by Vladimir Nikolov and others about a small hadrosauroid that was found in what's now Bulgaria. So hadrosaurs, again, they're the duck-billed dinos. They were medium-sized to large. They lived all over the world in the late Cretaceous. They were also very successful as a group. They've been found like in Europe, Asia, North America. Sometimes hadrosaurs were large, even when they lived in areas where they were expected to be small. And an example of this is this hadrosaur that was found in what is now Bulgaria that lived in the Cretaceous. Because at the time, Europe was a bunch of islands. And there's a island rule where dinosaurs and other animals often are smaller when they live on islands because there's limited space and resources. And there's also less predatory pressure, so the animals just get smaller over time, or often do. And small hadrosauroids have been found in Europe from the late Cretaceous, either because they were juveniles or because of the island rule, this insular dwarfism. The team did histology on the bones of this hadrosauroid that was found in Bulgaria from the late Cretaceous, and the fossils were collected in 1985 in a cave. When they were first found, it was unclear if the bones were from a small adult or a juvenile, but they found in the study that they belonged to a young, actively growing individual or individuals. So they correspond to late juveniles and young subadults of Maiasaura in terms of size. There was no histology done, so you don't know the exact age, but originally it was estimated to be about 3.5 meters or 11.4 feet long based on a partial femur.
It's pretty small, but you said it was a juvenile of a medium-sized dinosaur, so that makes sense.
Well, I should say, yeah, originally there was no histology done, but in this study they did do histology on the right tibia, right fibula, and a bone fragment of an undetermined long bone, and then they reanalyzed other fragments. The fossils were found in 2 sites in the cave, so that's why it's unclear if these fossils come from one individual or multiple individuals. But again, they think it's from a juvenile or subadult. It was medium-sized, about 2 years old, and being medium-sized, not an island dwarf. They think the adult size of this kind of dinosaur would have been, quote, close to the mean adult body size in Hadrosauroidea, possibly comparable to that of many Western European and Asian American hadrosaurs, end quote. So this hadrosaur, its medium, largish size, seems to be an exception to the island rule. Interestingly, it had these fiber tissues in the bone similar to titanosaurs, which include Ampelosaurus and Magyarosaurus, and they're also similar to the hadrosauroid Telmatosaurus. It's considered to be this modified laminar bone, which, quote, is generally thought to indicate lower growth rates, which, at least in some taxa, might be linked to reduction of adult body size, end quote. So this hadrosauroid may have grown slower than its relatives, but the histology shows it's still most similar to late juveniles or early subadults of medium-sized hadrosaurids. It could be that this hadrosaur had these fiber tissues that made it grow slower because it was an adaptation for living on an island, and it's just the first step towards it, well, and its lineage evolving a smaller size, shrinking in size. There are, just as a side note, other hadrosaurs that were about 6 to 7 meters or 19 to 23 feet long that lived in the Cretaceous in what's now Europe, but they lived on larger islands. So why was this one possibly evolving to shrink? Well, the formation where it was found seems to show shallow water or temporary dry lands based on the fossils found. So it could be that there were these receding waters that led to these short-lived land bridges, and then dinosaurs could have used them to migrate. So maybe this one had relatively recently arrived on the island and now it was starting to adapt.
And shrink.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard before that you could look at the type of fibered tissues in the bone to see that it is a type of bone that grows more slowly.
Yeah. So many small details that can tell you a lot about a dinosaur. We'll get more into the small dinosaurs in a moment. But first, the dinosaur of the day. So on to our dinosaur of the day, Giraffatitan, which was a request from Ellie via our Patreon and Discord. And like you said, Garrett, it was a titanosaur. So a titanosaur sauropod. It lived in the late Cretaceous in what is now Minas Gerais, Brazil, in the Serra da Galga formation.
I'm glad it's a titanosaur because it ends in titan, and things that end in titan should be titanosaurs. They aren't always, but they should be.
Does make it easier to remember. It looked like other titanosaurs. It was giant and robust. It had a long neck, a long tail, a small head. It walked fairly upright on all fours. Titanosaurs had tails that were flexible and strong. It had robust bones. It's one of the best known titanosaurs. At least one bone for each part of the skeleton has been found. And more than 60 bones were found. They include neck, back, tail bones, pelvic bones, limb bones. No skull has been found, though.
Womp womp.
Yeah.
Even one of the best known titanosaurs is missing the skull.
Skulls are hard to find, especially for sauropods.
Yep.
The fossils were originally thought to belong to at least 3 individuals, but a later study found they belonged to at least 5 individuals, and at least one of them was juvenile. And then one of the individuals is considered to be a giant, because it's estimated to grow up to 85 feet or 26 meters long. But the other individuals were estimated to be between 33 and 49 feet or 10, 15 meters long.
So those are just large and giant, not super giant.
I guess so. Like other sauropods, they grew quickly and without interruption early on, and then as they matured, they grew in cycles with some periodic slowdowns. The type species is Giraffatitan ribeiroi, and the genus name means Giraffatitan. It refers to Uberaba, which is the city near where the fossils were found, and the species name is in honor of Luis Carlos Borges Ribeiro, quote, director of the Centro de Pesquisas Paleontológicas Llewellyn Price, for his consistent support of paleontological research in Minas Gerais state, end quote. Giraffatitan was named in 2008 by Leonardo Salgado and Ismar de Souza Carvalho. The fossils were found at a road cut along a highway. All the fossils were found in one quarry, and they were collected over a period of 4 years. Giraffatitan had unique features on the tibia and fibula, like a protuberance, something that stuck out on the tibia that formed a joint with the fibula. The holotype includes leg bones and ankle bones. It used to actually include more fossils, but it's unclear if those belong to the same individual. There's another specimen found known as DGM Series A that may be Giraffatitan, or it might be a close relative. There's also 2 teeth that may belong to Giraffatitan, and one of them is the largest titanosaur tooth found so far.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's got a crown measuring 2.4 inches or 6.2 centimeters high. But we don't know for sure if those teeth are from Giraffatitan.
I mean, a 2.5-inch tooth isn't that impressive for a dinosaur, but I guess for a titanosaur.
Well, if you're comparing to a theropod, sure. But a titanosaur, yeah. And those teeth are chisel-like and slender. There was a study in 2015 done that found bone pathologies in Giraffatitan that includes 2 fused mid-tail vertebrae and a healing fracture also in the middle of the tail. It had a bony overgrowth in the formable lumps. And this could have been from arthritis, an inflammatory disease, or an internal infection, which doesn't sound pleasant. Giraffatitan lived in an area with plains, rivers, and small temporary ponds. Other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include titanosaurs, such as Bruhathkayosaurus and Trigonosaurus, and dromaeosaurs, such as Ipupiara. And other animals that lived around the same time and place include crocodilomorphs and mollusks. And for our fun fact of this episode, we've talked about the largest dinosaurs, but how about the smallest?
How about them?
There's two groups of dinosaurs that shrank over time. We mentioned one earlier. It's the group that led to birds. And there's also alvarezsaurs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like you were saying, there were a lot of groups that shrank over time, like various lineages of sauropods.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you're saying...
the big groups? I don't know how to...
groups that we don't know of getting bigger and we only know of shrinking over time, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's the way to put it. Because there are other small groups like Scansoriopterigids. That's the group known for climbing and gliding. They lived in the Jurassic and what's now China, and there's 4 species. There's Ambipteryx, Epidexipteryx, Scansoriopteryx, and E. A juvenile Scansoriopteryx were about the size of sparrows, about 16 centimeters or a little more than 6 inches long. And then adult Epidexipteryx were about the size of pigeons, but with a long tail. This group also had long third fingers, and at least 2 of the species had a bone that grew from the wrist to support a bat-like wing membrane for gliding. They also had short high skulls, large front teeth, long arms, varying tail lengths. They spent a lot of time in trees. We don't think that this group shrank over time, though. So back to the alvarezsaurs. There's an interesting paper published a few years ago by Zichuan Qin and others in Current Biology that looked at growth and miniaturization among alvarezsaurs. And alvarezsaurs, they were the small 2-legged theropod dinosaurs that only had 1 functional finger or claw on each hand.
Yeah, I sometimes refer to them as chest-clawed weirdos because they had super short arms with just the 1 claw, basically, probably barely sticking out past feathers on their chest.
Yeah. It turns out that this group shrank really fast. Why did they do this? Well, for birds, getting smaller seems to be linked to flight, but it's less clear for alvarezsauroids because they couldn't fly or glide.
Yeah, definitely not with those little arms.
But they shrank at least 2 orders of magnitude. Some of the places I was reading, they said they shrank 3x over a period of 25 million years, 110 to 85 million years ago, which was, quote, comparable to the body size doubling of tyrannosauroids within 16 million years, which, quote, suggests very strong selective pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't shrink uniformly, and they all had different ways of growing. That seems to be the theme here. Dinosaurs all had different growth strategies. So the team studied 18 taxa, and they did histology on multiple specimens. And they found, for example, that Shushugonicus, Shishionicus, and Albinicus were adults. They found that Shiunicus and Banicus were subadults. They found Haplokyrus and Shibuya to be juveniles, and they found Aron to be a hatchling.
So they range from hatchling, juvenile, adult.
Mm-hmm. The 2 smallest and most closely related, Shishionicus and Albinicus, quote, exhibit markedly different life histories but very similar body sizes, end quote. So Shishionicus was about 11 years old but grew slower. Albinicus was about 3 years old but grew more quickly, and both were at these advanced growth stages, so they were adults. Haplokyrus grew quickly. It was one of the larger ones in terms of weight, coming in at around 41 kilograms or 90 pounds, but it was a juvenile at only age 4. And Shishionicus and Albinicus had more consistent, slow growth. The largest one was the adult Bonapartenicus, coming in at over 71 kilograms, or about 157 pounds, but the age of that one, specimen's unclear. And then the smallest adult was Parvicursor at 0.15 kilograms, which is about a third of a pound.
Yeah, well, that's right there talking about 3 orders of magnitude. 0.1 kilograms to 70 kilograms. That's 3 orders of magnitude.
Ah, yes. They said during the, quote, first 70 million years of alvarosaurid evolution, body masses range between 10 kilograms and 50 kilograms, with one exception, the 72 kilogram Bonapartenicus, end quote. And they think that the ancestral alvarosaurids weighed about 50 pounds or 23 kilograms. So again, back to the why did they shrink? Well, at least some alvarosaurs like Mononicus ate insects. And it could be that this group became specialized insect eaters, and that made them shrink down, because it all happened around the same time that termites started flourishing.
Oh, interesting. That's more evidence for maybe they were termite specialists.
Yeah. So it could be that the one functional finger could rip into the logs to get to insects, and then they could have the more powerful arms for digging. And that all reminded me of when we talked about the weird claws of Therizinosaurs and Alvarsaurs back in episode 434, where the Alvarsaurs, they got smaller over time, and so did their claws, but the size of the claws didn't affect how useful they were. Early Alvarosaurids couldn't really scratch dig well, but they could grasp and pierce, and then later Alvarosaurids with their short arms had some advantages, like they could use more force in the arms and claws and bear lots of stress, and later ones could also efficiently dig. So late Cretaceous Alvarosaurids like Linhanicus may have specialized in digging and therefore eating insects or termites.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, because you can't have well, maybe you could, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to have an anteater that's the size of like a T-Rex.
Yeah.
Because just walking around to get to different termite mounds
takes too much energy.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're trying to specialize on these really tiny animals, it makes sense to be able to get at them in more than one way. Whereas if you're huge, you might sort of be limited.
Yeah. So one last fun fact to my fun fact here. We've talked about the small dinosaurs, but which one was the smallest? And that's maybe a trick question.
The bee hummingbird?
Ah, yes.
I did that as a fun fact
a while back. I know, we've talked about it before. So yeah, bee hummingbird has been found in Cuba, 2.25 inches long, 5.7 centimeters, often mistaken for bees, weighs less than 2 grams, weighs less than a dime.
That's so crazy. I still can't believe that light. 2 inches long and weighs less than a dime. That just doesn't make any sense.
I like that they lay eggs the size of a coffee bean. Sounds real cute.
That's crazy. No animal with vertebrae should weigh less than 2 grams. It's absurd.
It sounds cute.
I think a lot of that size is feathers, and that's the cheat they're using.
Could be. So yeah, now we've covered the biggest dinosaurs and the smallest dinosaurs, and that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino and Dinosaur Size. Again, if you want to check out our sources, be sure to head over to our show notes at iknowdino.com. Stay tuned. Next week, we will be talking about at least one other new dinosaur. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.